Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Christina Gomez and I am a librarian at Milwaukee Public Library. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for Good Time Party Girl, The Notorious Life of Dirty Helen Cromwell with author Christina Ward. And this event is co-sponsored by Boswell Book Company and Feral House Publishing. I want to give Daniel Golden, owner of Boswell Books, a moment to say hello. So Daniel, I'm going to unmute you now if you want to greet everyone.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be part of this event. And we do have copies of Good Time Party Girl for sale, as it is available at fine stores everywhere. May I just say a tiny bit about Christina Ward? I can't believe this. I was going through papers trying to figure out, throw away something, and I came to notes when I was going to open, when Howard Schwartz was closing, before the Downer store came together. I was looking at the possibilities of opening a store in Bayview, and one of the notes I wrote was customers, and I could only think of two, and one was Mr. Tabard, who I've never heard of again, and the other one was Chris Ward. So anyway, thank you for that, being a wonderful bookstore customer in Bayview, knowing your book lovingness comes through and through, and you can see that today with your work at Feral House in Process. So thanks for letting me be here, and back to you, Christina.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I want to mention to everyone, if you haven't already, please visit the Milwaukee Public Library webpage. It's mpl.org/stay connected. And you can also follow us on social media. We have so many great virtual programs happening every day and for all ages. So please take a moment to check us out. And I also, at the start of all of our programs this week, am taking time to share a few words from Milwaukee Public Library Director Paula Kiley's statements on race and social equity. So I'm going to quote the statement directly now. The Milwaukee Public Library is a trusted community asset that endeavors to serve all Milwaukee residents. We condemn all racial inequities, including the recent murders and assaults that have led to ongoing demonstrations and protests in Milwaukee and throughout the country. MPL's mission is to help build healthy families and vibrant neighborhoods by helping people read, learn, and connect. To fulfill this mission, MPL acknowledges and will work to dismantle systemic racism and is committed to achieving equity, understanding this is an ongoing process. The library director's full statement is listed as a handout within this webinar, so you should have a handouts section kind of built into your screen. That statement also includes a link to curated reading lists for adults, for caregivers, for teens, and for children. So I hope you have the opportunity to read and reflect on the full statement, and then also share your feedback with Milwaukee Public Library. So thank you for allowing me a moment to share that with you. But now I'm going to introduce Christina. So Christina Ward is a cultural explorer and excavator. She is a Milwaukee native who now lives in Cudahy, and she loves every single thing about books except for writing them. And she is now working on her third book, which is about cookbooks published by cults, communes, and new religious movements in the United States. She is the vice president of Feral House Process Publishing, an internationally acclaimed independent publisher. And today she's here to bring local legend, the notorious Dirty Helen Cromwell, to life for us. So following Christina's presentation, we'll have time for question and answer, and you can enter your questions directly into the question box. And if you have any technical issues, feel free to use that question box as well, and I can help you or one of my colleagues. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Christina. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. It's a To Christina evening. Thanks, everybody, for joining me virtually. You are in my home, and I hope that you are safe in your homes. I'm here to talk about Dirty Helen Cromwell, who is a Milwaukee legend. But if you're under 70, maybe not so much. I learned about Dirty Helen Cromwell from my father-in-law, who was a retired vice cop. And Helen, if you weren't familiar with her at all, owned a bar on St. Paul Avenue. Essentially, if you think about the geography of Milwaukee, where St. Paul Avenue intersects a little bit down the block from Sobelman, so 18th and St. Paul. Unfortunately, the bar is gone, the building is gone, and the legend of Helen was nearly gone. What made Helen such a popular fixture in Milwaukee was she had the thing that earned her her nickname, a filthy mouth. She was a champion at swearing. People would visit and come to the bar just to hear her curse them out and curse their friends out. It became kind of a shtick, if you will. What a lot of folks in Milwaukee didn't know at all was coming to Milwaukee to open a bar was her retirement plan. She came to Milwaukee in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. And that was essentially after living a pretty robust 25 years around the country, having a pretty good time. Christina, could you show us the first picture?
Right, yep, so the picture of the book cover, and then
there you go. So that's Helen. That photo was taken in 1946. And at that time, Helen was about a 60-year-old lady. She worked always behind the bar. It was a very small place. It was infamous for not having any real chairs at all. She said that finally that she gave into the complaints and put like 4 chairs in. But most of the time, people just threw their coats on the floor and just hung around and had a good time. What made Helen's story so interesting to me was that she wrote it herself. So the original version of her book was written and published in the 1960s, officially published in '66. The story of the publishing is a little sad. Helen, towards the end of her life, was not necessarily indigent, not homeless, but really not living, kind of a retiree life. She eventually developed some illnesses, a lot of them due to kind of hard living and working a job where you're standing on your feet most of the day, and developed severe varicose veins. That doesn't seem like a big deal now, but in the early 60s it did, and the surgeries to repair it were quite painful. She ended up spending the remainder of her years, and she lived to, in the early until she was about 83, at the county hospital grounds. There was the old age pensioners home out there, and that's where she spent her life. Those last few years, though, is she had always been working on her own notes because she was such a charismatic figure. People said, Helen, you should write the story. Helen, you should write a book. And she did. Again, published with kind of a help of ghostwriter in 1966. Unfortunately, as happened many times in Helen's life, she was taken advantage of and didn't really see any of the proceeds from that book. Christina, could you show us the next picture? And so here is a picture that was taken, and you could notice by the car, was taken in the early 30s. And this was a picture of what she called the Sunflower Inn. If you look closely, what looks like weeds out in front of the bar are actually sunflowers. It was kind of a whimsical thing she did and planted all the sunflower seeds. During Prohibition era, she was a very savvy, smart businesswoman. When we think of speakeasies, usually you think of like nightclubs, so at night. She decided to do it differently, and her specialty was that she was open during the day. So she'd open at 11 a.m. and serve a hot meal, not like a restaurant, but you came in, you got some. She made like a big family meal. And so guys from working in the factories all along the Menominee Valley would start coming in to drink, of course, and to get a free meal. That was her kind of marketing ploy. Come in for lunch and a drink. Famously, she only served 2 kinds of alcohol. No beer, not in Milwaukee, no beer, but only bourbon and scotch. That was it. So that was your choice. You had a bourbon or a scotch, and that was like one of the sources of fun for people, is if you went in there and you didn't know that and you ordered something besides a bourbon or a scotch, you would get an earful. Because this is the public library, I'm not going to repeat some of the things that Helen would say to folks, but of course you could read about them. One of the fun things in rediscovering and researching her story is that this is a woman who really, you could say, was almost an early a feminist, if you will. She made a lot of choices that are complicated and difficult. So Christina, could you show us the next picture? So that's a picture in about 1887. That is the only childhood picture of Helen. She was born in Noblesville, Indiana, and actually to what was considered like a wealthier family. And Christina, if you can show us the next picture then. At age 16, she fell in love and ran away from home, essentially, to marry a fella who maybe wasn't the best choice. And that was pretty indicative of Helen's life, as she fell in love hard and often got taken advantage of, unfortunately. But what that first early runaway love affair turned into a marriage, and she ran away to Cincinnati. And if we think about the German cities of the Midwest, and Milwaukee and Cincinnati, Buffalo, very similar in culture. And her husband was the manager of one of the big beer bars in Cincinnati. And he also became quite associated with some of the whorehouses in Cincinnati. The marriage was not a happy one. And through that discovery of kind of her husband's affairs and the nightlife, a different life than the one that she had grown up knowing, she became enamored of it. She loved fine clothes, and she loved go dancing, and she loved a good time. And so eventually she left her husband, and this was in about maybe 1910, which was not unheard of, but uncommon at the time, and took off for New York, then San Francisco, then the Yukon, and all the time. She talks about this in her book and her life, that she never liked the word prostitute. She never liked the word call girl, because as she said, there weren't phones then. So that's where we got the title of the book, Good Time Party Girl. That's what she liked to refer to herself, because she always actually worked a job. During her days in San Francisco and New York, she worked in women's clothing and millinery. She was infamous for her really good taste in hats. She loved hats, and that's a recurring theme throughout the book. The picture you see here again is her holding up bottles of scotch from the old Fitzgerald Company. It was the only brand that she served. And you can see that the folks, just as they do now, and again, this is some of the shots in the mid-40s, that she's having a pretty good time, and so is everybody else at the bar. Part of my research into this book, hearing the stories from my father-in-law, who would actually, when he was walking the beat, would go and check in on Helen when he was a beat cop in the 50s. The idea of that she just didn't pop out of nowhere. So I learned her early history. I also found some of her family. She has family left in Cincinnati, and they were very happy to work with me to bring their great-grandmother's story back. So much so, though, enough years have passed that where it was considered kind of a source of shame for the family, they've really embraced their matriarch's legend. And when we had a big party at Great Lakes Distillery this past year, when we had the book come out, many of her family members came up from Cincinnati to kind of essentially party with us, because we'll show you this too. Here's the fun at home. So I'm holding up this is a bottle of Dirty Helen bourbon made by Great Lakes Distillery. So what I found out when I started working on the Helen project was that there were a few other folks too who had heard the legend of Helen from their grandparents, or maybe their parents, the wildest bar in Milwaukee, and it was Helen's Place. And people usually refer to it as Helen's, though its official name was the Sunflower Inn. And Guy Rehorst, who runs Great Lakes Distillery, is one of those who his family grew up in the bar business, owning a bar on the South Side, and he knew who Helen was. And so to commemorate Helen's memory, they started making a cask strength bourbon. Why that's an important word is cask strength is what they would do in Prohibition time, because you were going to dilute that bourbon when you're finally going to sell it to the end customer. So when they were shipping and making it, they made it extra strong. The fun thing is the first batch sold out like within a day or two last year. And so in a few weeks, they're doing a batch 2, which I'm told by Mr. Rehorst and the gang down at Great Lakes Distillery that is even stronger than the first one. So we were thrilled to work with them and again, keep Helen's memory alive. one of the things, again, that's an interesting idea about bringing back these women's narratives, and that's an important thing for me, is these are women's stories that we don't always think about. We don't associate, if you say, look at the people having a good time at the bar, we don't associate that kind of wildness with our parents and our grandparents. But Helen's story, reading it in her words, is very much like listening to her tell you that story herself in the bar. And it's one that, again, she holds nothing back. One of the things that I did as a kind of bringing this book back as an editor, if you will, is it was expurgated. When it was first published in 1966, there was a lot of words changed to make it more PG. We put all the F-bombs back into it. And so we think it's better for it because that's the way Helen actually wrote it. Christina, could you show us the next picture? So there's another picture of Helen in the mirror. And then Christina, the next one. Now, if you notice, at Helen's bar, there were a lot of fellas. She always got along with guys, and though she did have some very close women friends, again, of the time period, women were not as socially encouraged to go out to bars or taverns. So a lot of the folks you see are men. We've been working on a project, and maybe you seeing this picture can help us out here. These were archived in her family's photo album. They don't have much of Helen at all because she died essentially destitute at the county grounds. So they don't have many memorabilia or photos or anything, and these are all scans of what they do have. We know this story that Joe McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who was attending Marquette, actually used to work for Helen as kind of her cleanup guy. He would help scrub down the bar and hang out. And during his last semester of school, according to the legend goes, at Marquette, he was going to have to drop out because he didn't have enough money. And according to the legend, Helen paid for his semester at Marquette for, I don't think she expected that to turn out the way it eventually did. But we had heard other stories, and I've heard them from 7 different people, that Helen actually paid for, whether it's all 4 years or just a semester or two, fellas at Marquette to pay their tuition when they were going to drop out. So what you can help us with is, if you've heard that story, if you know or can prove to us, because we'd love to get the proof, just for the kind of check that box of if Helen paying for one of your relatives' college education at Marquette, please contact me and let me know. And as well as in this picture, we think that's Joe McCarthy with her. We're pretty sure. Christina, can you forward to the next picture? And because there's Joe McCarthy when he's older as a senator. And on the back of it, the ink is very faded, so I didn't scan it for you to see today, is you can actually, it's autographed from Joe McCarthy to Helen. And it's a very sweet note about how much he loves her. And not in a creepy way, but in a totally, very kind, loving way, that he just was really grateful. And so we have documented that they were friends. But we haven't documented some of the other stories, specifically about her paying for his school. So again, any of you historians out there can find out for me. I'll let you know too that I did contact Marquette University, who is the repositor of all of Joe McCarthy's personal papers. Those are sealed for a couple more years. Can't get in those yet. So again, if you guys know, let us know, because we'd love to find that out. Part of the reason you're like, well, why would you want to find something like that out? If you read the book, some of the stories that Helen tells are almost unbelievable. And it became one of those things of like hearing the stories from my father-in-law, then hearing stories from other people, then reading her stories. I started being kind of questioning. It's like, is she just a fabulist? Is she just making all this up? What's fantastic is the stories that you think are the most incredible, the least likely, are absolutely true. There's a story that she tells in the book about hailing a cab and getting the cab, I think his name was George, to agree to drive her to Louisville, Kentucky, to go to a party celebrating the Seitzel distillery. that was the source. That's who made House of Lords Scotch. And that sounds so crazy. So she took the cab, they go to Louisville, go to the party. She has a great time. Next morning, cab driver drives her back home. Nuts. I'm like, I can figure this one out. So the family who runs that distillery at that time is actually still in business today. And many people will know that as Patty Van Winkle bourbon. So I called Julian Seitzel, and then the story is referring to his grandfather that invited Helen to come to Louisville. And fantastically, wonderfully, Julian confirmed every single bit of it. He said that was one of his family legendary stories that his grandfather told all the time about this wonderful, crazy bartender in Milwaukee who took a cab down to go to one of their parties. So I encourage folks to learn these fun bits of Milwaukee history. And if you can help us identify, she paid for Joe McCarthy's education at Marquette, that'll help us too. Christina, could you hit the next picture for me? So I want to bring it, this is a fun picture, another bit of Milwaukee history and another one of the photos. So this painting of the nude was from what we know as the Grove Hotel in Milwaukee. Now, Helen used to claim to all the patrons at going to the bar that it was a portrait of her painted when she was, as she said, whoring in the Yukon. Truth be told, it was not. Helen bought the painting at auction when the hotel was torn down in the 20s and hung it up at the bar. And it became like a source. Now, if you kind of think back to some of the earlier pictures, the bar, again, tiny. The bar itself was maybe about 7 or 8 feet long total. You could see there were 4 chairs there. And so that painting essentially took up one half of the wall of the bar. So just Helen was full of those kinds of legends. When the book came out this past year, there are a few more other things that I wish I could have included because people came to me with new stories. One of the things that, as an artifact that we couldn't get, because I did search for the painting, I have a lead on it, but if anybody knows where that painting is, let me know. But I got a call from a local antique dealer who says, I need you to come out to my storage barn because I have Helen's bed. And we're like, wow. I contacted her family and we were all very interested. We went out there and sure enough, the story was pretty good. It sounded like the provenance was good, that it made sense. And it was this gorgeous Victorian bed. Why this is important to know is during the speakeasy days at Helen's place is she did run it as a brothel. That's the truth of it. It wasn't all just, fun and drinks. I mean, that's, she was a madam. She ran the brothel until, the dates it's hard to confirm, but we think until about like the late 40s. One of the biggest things that changed for her is that she was getting older, and with the repeal of Prohibition in the 30s and getting a legitimate liquor license, that she wanted to make sure that she wasn't breaking as many laws as, previously. Part of why Helen could get away with the things she did, the speakeasy and the brothel, is again, she, worked with the local authorities. She was also under the protection of Al Capone. Milwaukee at that time is, there's some differing opinions, and I'll argue with anybody who claims that Milwaukee was a Chicago Capone town. It wasn't. It was almost a neutral ground for the Italian mafia families during that time period, with an equal kind of influence of the Kansas City families as well as the Capone outfit. And so during that time period of Prohibition is, again, so people could work freely together. It was considered a bit of a neutral zone. But Helen herself was affiliated with Al Capone and many, many, many other notorious gangsters of the time period. And again, she details all of those stories in the book. So part of the fun thing about finding these artifacts and talking again about Helen is meeting with people. When we did have our party last year at Great Lakes Distillery, there was one gentleman who was 92 years old, And he used to go to Helen as a young Marquette, Helen's place as a young Marquette student. And we had an actress portraying Helen, and it was very sweet because he wasn't quite sure if it was actually Helen or not. In his mind, of course, he knew it was not because she'd been long dead. But of course, the stories are alive, and this is a rich piece of Milwaukee history that I'm really happy to bring back. And I hope that, you know, folks will continue to want to learn more about maybe some of the muckier corners and difficult histories of the citizens here of Milwaukee and in their own families. I think that we can learn a lot by by listening more to the stories of folks who didn't lead perfect lives, but were a little bit more human. So that's me blathering on for nearly 30 minutes about Helen, and I'm not going to tell you every single thing because I want you to check out the book from the library, or please, you know, support your local independent booksellers. But I'll open it up right now, and I know to see if we have any questions. We have the technological moment.
This is Fawn from the Tippecanoe Branch Library. We were going to host this program there, so thanks for bearing with us as we took this online. I'm just checking our question box, and we don't seem to have any questions. I'm just going to give people a little time if you want to just think a minute. If you have any questions, you can just click on the question tab and type in there. So I'll just give everybody a minute to do that.
And I stopped because I wanted to make sure I have time to answer any questions that you might have. And I know I'm a bit of a chatterbox, so I did want to give everybody the opportunity to share their questions. Feel free to ask about anything to do with Feral House Publishing, if you'd like. How does independent publishing work in the modern book world? What supporting your library and your independent booksellers do for independent publishers? As well as questions about Helen herself. I will tell you, as you guys think, maybe ponder if you have any questions, is Cromwell was not really her last name. Helen was married, as best as we can say, legally 6 times, illegally 2 more on top of that. The fella that she last married, his name was Cromwell. Like not Cromwell, but Cromwell. As she didn't like it, and so she just changed it. She thought Cromwell sounded classier, and that's something that she did quite often, is dispose of a name, dispose of a husband, which is kind of funny when you think about it in our modern age with a social security number, and we couldn't do like she did, is just kind of pack your best hats and your hidden diamond rings and just go to a new town and start all over, which is what Helen did a couple of times.
Well, hi, Christina. They're starting to roll in, so let me quickly get a question for you. How much time did your research take? Independent research must take a lot of time, someone says here.
It does take time, and it's a joy. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I'm guilty as a person, as a publisher, as a writer, of falling in the kind of the research rabbit hole. And so from deciding to move forward with the project and talking to the family first, it took us about 1.5 years of the research and re-editing and doing that work to get the book to, you know, where it's actually a book available to check out from the library. So it takes a lot of time. Sometimes, you know, you get those small things, you're doing some research, and then sometimes information, you know, flows in. Sometimes, you know, you just hit a brick wall all the time and you're ready to give up, and then you get somebody from left field who gives you a good piece of information to move on. For anybody who's looking at researching their own family histories or Milwaukee history, I highly recommend going to the Milwaukee County Historical Society downtown. It's a fantastic resource for folks, and you should use it. Use it. It's there for you. You can, even with the different types of quarantines happening, you're still able to make appointments to go in and do research, as well as the Milwaukee Public Library has a tremendous amount of resources available. Any questions?
Yes, we have a few more. Someone asks, was she associated with any of the other known crime figures from Milwaukee that you know of?
You know, it's funny, in her younger life, so when she wrote this book, when she started writing it, so the Sunflower Inn, Helen's Place, closed in 1961, and she died in 69, and the writing of it, her book was published in 66. So that 5 years of her making her notes and writing and doing things, she was still kind of active in Milwaukee. There were a couple on other Milwaukee places, especially clubs that were downtown, the clubs in the Pfister Hotel. She liked to hang out there, and they would hire her essentially to be like a party girl, to like kind of be a party starter. She was that popular a figure in Milwaukee. So when it comes to naming names of people of that time period, she doesn't, and which was kind of like a very frustrating as a researcher to try to figure it out. You can read them and guess. I guessed a little bit, but not enough to put it in writing. So yeah. That answers that. But she does talk about all the if the crime figure was dead, then she named who it was. If he wasn't, then she didn't. That was kind of her rule.
That makes sense. Someone asks here, with all her moving around, how many years did she actually live in Milwaukee, and how long was the Sunflower Inn open?
So the Sunflower Inn opened in 1926 as a speakeasy, and then went legit after Prohibition, and then closed in about 1960, 61. So it was here for about 40 years. Helen then lived until 1969, and when she got to town, she opened the bar. So she herself was here for nearly 50 years.
Someone asks, do you have any more information about her relationship with Al Capone, what that was like?
Oh, sure. So it's interesting, is she always referred to Al as a friend. But at the same time, I've heard stories from her grandson, who he himself was in his 80s. And yeah, because Helen had kids. So I've heard some of the stories, and there's some speculation on her family's part that he was much more than a friend. But she only refers to him as a friend. She also worked for Al in a small capacity, like he was her booze provider to the Sunflower during the speakeasy days. Helen, when she was in Chicago, which she was for a time, would do errands and help Al Capone. There's a couple of great stories of Al helping Helen out, which are really funny. In Helen's telling of it, Al Capone knew exactly who he was. And he used it to good effect for Helen's benefit a few times.
Here's an interesting question. What bar in Milwaukee today best embodies the Sunflower Inn?
You know, that's a question for 30 years ago me. I don't get out to the bars as much anymore. I think, let me put it this way, I think any bar that has a really highly personality-driven bartender, where you're going because you know you're going to have a good time because of who's behind the bar, that's the place that's most like Helen's. Helen inspired then in Milwaukee a number of other foul-mouthed women bartenders. Marcy at the Holler House, who recently died. It became kind of a Milwaukee thing to have an abusive, filthy-mouthed women bartenders. I'm not sure if that's really anywhere else. I haven't seen that anywhere else, but definitely in Milwaukee, that was a thing.
Very nice. The other Christina, we had a request to just roll through photos 1 through 5 again, because someone came in a little bit late. If you're able to just
sure.
while we're talking. Thank you, Christina.
And so this is almost, let's go to the last photo first, if we don't mind. So I wanted to show you, this is the last photo of Helen. And that was a year before she died. And you can see that, you know, she's an old lady now. And the family suspects, based on the information that they have, that towards the last few years of her life, she probably suffered from some sort of dementia. So that's and kind of, you could say it's a sad ending, but man, what a fabulous life she led. So now you can probably scroll through the beginning and I can kind of point out what those pictures are. So there's Helen in about 1946. She's very short too. I'm 5'8", so she's very short. There's a picture of the Sunflower Inn, and that was the address was 1806 West St. Paul Avenue. The building is no longer standing. You can see there's an old Schlitz sign if it went legit. There's Helen when she was a year old. Oop. There's Helen, about a year old. That's the only childhood picture they have of her. That's it. And this is later, again, in 1946 at the bar itself. You can see how small that is. That is in the Milwaukee tradition of just those kind of front room, European style, kind of living room bars. And we still have some of those left in town. There's some great old bars. I'm thinking of, there's one on Kinnickinnick in St. Francis. And there's a few up in River West that are still kind of just, you know, used to be somebody's living room and now it's a bar.
Someone says they own a bar in Chicago called The Hideout, and they say it's a very similar bar. Have you heard of that before, The Hideout in Chicago?
The Hideout is a famous, infamous bar, and that's a really good comparison. Helen, if you can imagine how small that bar was, one of the things that she always did from speakeasy time to other times was she always had a piano player, a good piano player. For a while it was Al Sarnow. She was friends with all of the big Midwest band leaders, big band. She loved jazz and big band sounds. And she always had a live piano player at that little bar. And then later, just like they did at the Hideout, she knocked, you know, a wall. You can't see me moving, but she knocked a wall down that was an actual living space and made that a little bigger to have allow for more people to come in. And that place, Helen's, was hopping every night.
Here's an interesting question. My mother remembers a pet at her bar. Are there any mentions in the autobiography about that?
There are not. That's a new piece of information I didn't hear. I've never heard that before.
Well, that's really neat.
So, somebody will have to get my email and tell me what they remember their mom or grandma saying about what kind of pet Helen had at the bar.
Oh, for sure. Well, we'll put you two in contact.
Absolutely.
Daniel from Basel asks, did the Sunflower Inn have any other famous patrons?
It was the official bar of the Milwaukee Braves. Actually, I should say the unofficial bar of the Milwaukee Braves. Helen when she came to Milwaukee, she fell in love with Milwaukee. And this is, you know, she'd lived in big cities and she really, you know, she looked at this as her settling down period. And she really fell in love with baseball. And it was the time of first post-war really bringing baseball in a professional level back. And she was a huge supporter and was there. She was their guest of honor at their personal party in 1957 when the Braves won the World Series. She was an enthusiastic baseball fan. So, of course, all of the guys, if you look at her, and we have images I scanned from some of her sign-in books from the bar that are inside the Good Time Party Girl, is autographs from all of the Braves and all the other baseball players that used to come in and drink. So that's kind of fun.
Someone asks, are either of Helen's sons still around? Were they helpful in researching this if they are?
So part of the story is sometimes, you know, and these are the things, I wrote a short afterword based on all my research and talking to the family, is when Helen left, she had two sons, she took one with her and put him in a very good boarding school, and the other stayed with his father in Cincinnati, and the boys were separated. They were reunited as teenagers, but they were ashamed of their mother. They did not want to have a relationship with her at all. Their grandchildren, respectively, did have a kind of somewhat of a relationship with their grandmother, but as time heals those types of familial wounds, her grandson is still alive, and he's in his 80s. and her great-grandchildren and are all alive and embrace Helen's legacy. So that family, they're all in Cincinnati. They were very helpful, very kind and generous with sharing both their memories and some of the photos that you see here.
Did she have any other children besides the two boys?
No, it was the two boys. That was it.
Someone asks here, I read the original book a long time ago. Does this version have any new material?
It has the new material in so much that I wrote an afterword that kind of follows up with the holes a little bit in Helen's life, as well as what happened to her. This edition has images. We put all the swearing back in. But other than that, we didn't have any really new material. If I find new material, that's why I'm always interested in learning more. If there's ever a new updated edition, I will update this because I think these are great stories to keep around.
Tom asks, what did you learn about Milwaukee over the course of researching that surprised you?
You know, I'm not sure if you guys read on Milwaukee.com or any of Bobby Tanzillo's writing. Bobby and I are friends. Bobby writes great Milwaukee history books. There's a kind of a small group of us that are really interested in the different types of history of Milwaukee. So this was already in my wheelhouse. But what I learned really was how benignly corrupt everybody was. So from the 20s to the 30s, and it was very much as long as you stayed within a certain kind of designated parameter, you know, as long as, like for Helen, as long as she operated during the day, didn't get too crazy, you know, wasn't too wild, the police left her alone. And it wasn't because she was hiding, it was a hide in plain sight. They knew exactly what was going on. There's a story that she tells in the book about like an overambitious federal agent who tries to arrest them. And the mayor and the chief in Milwaukee, the chief of police, intervened and put an end to that because they drank at Helen's too. So there was always that kind of low-level benign corruption.
Someone's asking, did you say that you discovered Helen's story from your father-in-law in his role as a beat cop? Is that right, where the inspiration came from?
Yep, nice. Yep, that's where I heard the story. I mean, I'm always a listener. I like stories. My father-in-law, who died a few years ago at a good ripe old age, he worked for the Milwaukee Road. He worked as a Milwaukee police detective for a while, and then for the Milwaukee Road again. And he had some really great stories about just Milwaukee, about being a cop in Milwaukee, especially in the 50s and early 60s. And so that was kind of, for me, the inspiration to kind of dig down a little bit more.
The owner of the hideout is asking if Milwaukee had 26 girls. Roll the dice and drinks. Does that sound familiar to you?
We weren't that big time. Nope, it wasn't. So Milwaukee was pretty low level. Again, it was kind of everybody kept to their own patch. And so we're gonna leave that one alone and let everybody wonder what they're referring to, and can do a little Google foo and figure that one out.
Someone's asking, did Helen call her original version of her book by the same name, Good Time Party Girl?
She actually called it Dirty Helen. Wait, I'm going to reach around right here. This is what the first edition, the original one, looked like. Not a really good picture, but it was called Dirty Helen. The reason we changed it, where in 1966, you could say Dirty Helen in Milwaukee, in Chicago, and you knew exactly who they were talking about. But in 2019, 2020, nobody knows who that is. And so that's where we altered the title, and plus honoring her own, what she referred to herself as, a good time party girl.
Very nice. Lori's asking a little more about how she spent her last days on the county grounds.
Sure. So Helen had, and anybody who's tended bar will be sympathetic, is Helen had terrible varicose veins. And repair surgery for that time in the she had it twice. She had it done in the 50s and then later again in the early 60s. And it's essentially, it's pretty grim when you think about it. It's called vein stripping. They're actually kind of taking them out and stripping them. It's very painful. And so by the second surgery, she had to close the bar. She was always just like, besides hiring a piano player, she was always a one-person operation. So without the money coming in from the bar, she owned that building, but she mortgaged it to, you know, one of her so-called friends who wasn't really that friendly. And he collected on that mortgage and she lost the building when she got out of the hospital. So after that, that was kind of a hard time for her. That's when she, you know, was not in the best of health. She's like she's in her 70s now, and she was still hanging out at the Pfister, hanging out at nightclubs, and going down to Chicago. There's a great story about her getting thrown out at age 75 by Phyllis Diller. You know, hey, that's a great story. So when by the time that she was really starting to get infirm, and like I mentioned earlier, the family thinks that there might have been an element of dementia there. The family tells kind of a sad story of that, kind of hearkening back to her younger exploits, is that she got on a Greyhound bus wearing a fur coat and nothing underneath and took the bus to Cincinnati in the middle of winter. And so she went to her sons, and her sons kind of, you know, and again, they weren't thrilled with her, and they just kind of put her back on, put clothes on her, and then put her on a bus back to Milwaukee. So one of the things that I think people forget is with the name Dirty Helen is she was always a lady. And so that's what we think the dementia really played a role towards the end, because she was always very fastidious about her appearance, and really enjoyed like fine clothing and hats, as I mentioned earlier. So she started to get more disheveled. And that's when she was at the county home, people like kind of noticed that decline, though. She still had a hair appointment. Her hairdresser, who I spoke with, another older woman I was delighted to speak with, she would go to the home and do Helen's hair. I mean, because for all the filthy mouth, the talk, it was a shtick. When Helen died, she was both beloved by her friends and mourned by them, but at the same time, if you go back and look at the Milwaukee Journal, the Milwaukee Sentinel at times, she became like a figure of fun. They were making fun of her, which is kind of sad and very sexist. I'll say that right now.
When was the original autobiography published?
1966.
1966, during her lifetime?
During her lifetime. She died 3 years after. The original subtitle is "A zany, wonderful, unconventional ex-madam and tavern keeper tells of her adventures, the fascinating people she has known, and the exploits that make her a living legend." And all of that is true.
And you mentioned adding back in her swear words. Were there any other challenges of editing?
No. What I did do is where she kind of masked a few of the gangsters. I mean, she outright didn't name ones that at the time of the writing, so by the early 60s, if somebody was still alive, she did not give you their name. But she also, and even will tell you that she cloaked a few names of guys, and I did a little research, and I found out who those folks were, and so those are noted. So there's some extensive footnoting that goes on in this new edition, because what would have been common knowledge in 1966 isn't so much now. And so when she makes casual references to, you know, movie stars in the 20s or baseball players in the 40s, I make a little note so you know who those folks are.
All right, perfect. Someone asks, how has the indie publishing world changed between releases, and how is it the same?
Oh, you know, thanks. So independent publishing, I don't know, you know, people buy books and people love books, especially library people. But there's like two tiers of publishing. There's what is called like the Big Five. And they publish like probably 80% of the books that everybody buys and reads. And then the rest of us are independent publishers. Now, that's the way it is today. In the 66, when the original Dirty Helen book was published, everybody was pretty much an independent publisher. There was publishing centers, of course, in New York City, but there was also a very robust, active publishing industry in Los Angeles. Different today, though, they're still centered in New York with independent publishing. Now there's just different little centers that pop up. Given the technologies, is you can be in Cudahy and still, you know, work in publishing and do those things that are necessary. One of the big differences is what the press is like now. When, say, in the 1960s, independent press, it was very male-oriented, and so the same fellas who were writing for the New York Times were the same, you know, friends with the guys who ran the publishing house, and they'd all have martinis together at lunch, and that's who was going to review and write about the books. So that doesn't happen anymore because the publishing world is so decentralized. But I will say this, still getting the New York Times or every publisher's holy grail, getting somebody on Terry Gross. Those are still challenges and something we all still aspire to.
Very nice. I just want to mention in the handouts, we have also a PDF of just like quick links to Feral House Publishing and information about what Christina has going on, MPL, and also Boswell links. So if you haven't looked at that, I just want to direct your attention to that. It looks like we're done with questions. So I just want to say thank you so very much for coming and being willing to do this on a virtual platform for the library. It was really great. Thank you so much, Christina.
Oh, thank you for transitioning and making this happen. This is my first time doing a virtual event, so thanks for making it easy. And thank you, everybody out there, for attending.
Very nice. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.